She threw her whole body against my gate, crashed flat onto the pavement. Karen, the new HOA president, tried to force her way into my home. Like it belonged to her. Her dress was a mess. Her hair wild. Her face burning red with rage. Calling 911, she screamed frantically, dialing as if I had attacked her. But there was one thing she didn't know. My wife was the 911 dispatcher on duty that day. And me? I was a former real estate attorney. That call didn't help her. It kicked off one of the most humiliating moments of her life. Can you guess what happened next? Let me know where you're watching from. This one gets intense. It was a peaceful Sunday afternoon in October. When I first met Karen Thompson. I was out back fixing my fence, minding my own business, when I heard the distinctive click of heels on concrete. There she was, marching up my driveway, like she owned the place. Clipboard in hand, wearing a black blazer that screamed middle management. Her hair was pulled back so tight it looked painful. She had this expression that reminded me of a substitute teacher who'd lost control of the classroom. "Excuse me," she called out, her voice carrying that particular tone that instantly puts you on edge. "I'm Karen Thompson, the new HOA president. I need to inspect your property for compliance violations." She held up her clipboard, like it was some kind of federal badge. The way she clutched it, I could tell this piece of paper was her lifeline to feeling important. I set down my hammer and walked over, keeping my expression neutral. 8 years of living in this neighborhood had taught me to handle HOA drama diplomatically. "I'm David Martinez," I said, extending my hand. She barely touched it, like I might contaminate her manicured nails. "What kind of inspection are we talking about?" "A thorough review of all exterior modifications," she rattled off, consulting her clipboard. "Landscaping compliance and general adherence to community standards. Have the authority to enter any property within the HOA boundaries." The confidence in her voice was impressive, but I could hear something else underneath. A slight tremor that suggested she wasn't as sure as she wanted to appear. That's when my legal training kicked in. "You don't," I said calmly. "OA bylaws require written notice at least 48 hours in advance for any property inspections. And even then, entry is only permitted for specific violations that have been formally documented." I watched her face change as the words sank in. The mask of authority slipped, just a bit, revealing something desperate underneath. Karen's grip tightened on her clipboard. "I don't think you understand who you're dealing with," she said. Her voice rising slightly. "I have standards to maintain in this community. Property values depend on compliance." She started taking photos of my fence with her phone. Her movements becoming more frantic. "This will all be documented. Feel free to document whatever you'd like from the public sidewalk," I replied. "But you're not coming onto my property without following proper procedures." I noticed she kept mentioning standards and property values. Like a mantra she was using to convince herself she was doing something important. For a moment, Karen looked genuinely confused, like no one had ever told her no before. She muttered something about documentation and proper procedures, then looked me up and down, as if trying to size up her opponent. "You seem to know a lot about HOA law," she said suspiciously. "I should," I said with a slight smile. "I used to practice real estate law." The color drained from her face for just a second, before she tried to recover. But I could see the panic in her eyes. The realization that she'd picked a fight with someone who knew what they were talking about. Karen forced a smile that looked more like a grimace. "Well then," she said, backing toward the sidewalk, while still holding her phone up. "I suppose we'll be seeing each other again very soon." The way she said it wasn't friendly. It was a threat wrapped in suburban politeness. As she walked away, I noticed she kept looking back at my house, like she was already planning her next move. The next morning, I found an official-looking envelope taped to my front door. Inside was a notice of violations on HOA letterhead, listing 15 different infractions, ranging from unauthorized fence modifications to non-compliant mailbox positioning. Reading through it, I couldn't help but laugh. Half the violations were completely made up. The other half applied to properties throughout the neighborhood, including Karen's own house. But Karen wasn't stopping at paperwork. Over the next few days, I watched her systematic campaign unfold. Like a military operation. She started with social media. Posting in our neighborhood's next-door group about maintaining community standards and the importance of property compliance. Her posts were carefully worded to sound reasonable, but anyone reading between the lines could tell she was building a case against someone specific. Then came the personal visits. Watched from my kitchen window as Karen made her rounds, clipboard in hand, visiting neighbors with what looked like rehearsed presentations. She spent extra time at Mrs. Patterson's house 2 doors down. Mrs. Patterson, who'd been complaining about everything from leaf blowers to children's chalk art for years. I could see them both gesturing toward my house, their conversation animated and not friendly. The real brilliance of Karen's strategy became clear at the emergency HOA meeting she called for Thursday evening. She'd somehow convinced the board that we needed to discuss escalating compliance issues in the neighborhood. When I walked into the community center, I could feel the tension in the room. About 20 residents had shown up, which was unusual for our typically apathetic community meetings. Karen had prepared a PowerPoint presentation for a neighborhood dispute. She clicked through slides about property values. Community standards and the importance of uniform enforcement. Every slide seemed designed to paint me as some kind of neighborhood menace. Without actually saying my name. It was impressive in its calculated passive aggression. Some residents, she said, clicking to a slide with photos of various properties. Seemed to believe they're above the rules that everyone else follows. My fence appeared on the screen, along with photos of my mailbox, my garden, and even my welcome mat. The fact that she'd been documenting my property this thoroughly was both impressive and deeply creepy. But here's where Karen made her first real mistake. In her enthusiasm to build her case, she'd included photos of violations on other properties too, including her own. Mrs. Chun, who lived across the street, raised her hand during the question period. Why is David's fence a problem? She asked in her careful English. But Karen's fence is the same height. Mrs. Chun was pointing at Karen's property photos. You could see the confusion ripple through the room. What made Karen's approach particularly sneaky was her ability to frame everything in terms of community, welfare. And property values. She wasn't just complaining about my fence. She was protecting everyone's investment. She wasn't targeting me personally. She was ensuring uniform standards for all residents. The woman had studied the art of passive-aggressive warfare. And was deploying every tactic in the book. I had to admit, watching her work was like observing a master manipulator in action. Even if I was her primary target, her confidence never wavered, even when caught in obvious contradictions, which suggested someone who either genuinely believed her own propaganda or was so committed to her narrative that facts became irrelevant. After the meeting, 3 different neighbors approached me privately. Tom from down the street mentioned that Karen had tried to recruit him. To file a complaint about my aggressive dog, which was hilarious since I don't own a dog. Most telling was Mrs. Chum's comment. That woman came to my house 3 times, she said, shaking her head. She is very angry with you. Why is she so angry? That night, Linda came home from her shift at the police dispatch center, looking exhausted. Weird day, she said, kicking off her shoes. We've been getting these bizarre neighbor dispute calls lately. Someone keeps calling about noise complaints, but when officers show up, there's no noise. Then there are these welfare check requests that don't make any sense. She looked at me curiously. Everything okay in the neighborhood? By the end of the week, it became clear that Karen had moved beyond neighborhood politics. She was bringing in the big guns. Government authorities who had the power to make my life difficult. It started with the city noise inspector showing up at my door on Friday morning. Clipboard in hand, looking confused. "We received a complaint about excessive noise from this address," he said. Checking his paperwork. Loud music, power tools during restricted hours, that sort of thing. I looked at him. Then glanced around my quiet suburban street where the only sound was Mrs. Chun's wind chimes. "Sir," I said, "it's 10 o'clock in the morning on a Friday. I'm working from home. The loudest thing in my house right now is my coffee maker. Monday brought the building inspector. Investigating reports of unpermitted structural modifications. Was the code enforcement officer looking into potential zoning violations. Each time the officials seemed puzzled by what they found, which was a perfectly normal suburban house with all permits properly filed and displayed. Each time I was polite, cooperative, and increasingly annoyed. I decided it was time to go on the offensive. My years practicing real estate law had taught me something important. The best defense against a legal bully was overwhelming documentation. And precise knowledge of the rules. I spent the weekend researching HOA bylaws. Property rights. And harassment statutes. What I found was both encouraging and alarming. On Monday morning, I hand-delivered a formal complaint to the HOA board about Karen's conduct. It was 15 pages long. Cited relevant statutes and included a timeline of every incident with supporting documentation. I also sent Karen a cease and desist letter, professionally formatted and legally precise, demanding she stop her harassment campaign. The pattern of government inspections was becoming absurd. Each official who showed up seemed more confused than the last, holding complaints that described violations that simply didn't exist. The noise inspector returned twice more that week. Once for alleged construction noise at 6 in the morning, when I was still asleep, and again for reports of loud parties, when I was provably at work downtown. The building inspector came back with complaints about unauthorized additions. That turned out to be my original front porch. Built in 1987. And visible in the property records. By Thursday, I was starting to recognize the routine. An official would arrive looking apologetic, investigate non-existent violations, and leave with that particular expression. People get. When they realize they've been used as pawns in someone else's vendetta. Karen's response was swift and predictable. She called the police. I was in my home office when the doorbell rang at 8 p.m. 2 officers stood on my porch, looking professional but slightly apologetic. Mr. Martinez, the older officer said, "We've received a complaint about threatening behavior. A neighbor reported that you've been intimidating her and making her feel unsafe in her neighborhood." My heart sank, but my legal training kicked in. "Officers, I'd be happy to cooperate with your investigation. May I ask what specific behaviors were reported?" The younger officer consulted his notes. The complainant says you've been following her, taking photos of her property. And sending threatening legal documents. Almost laughed. The legal documents were a cease and desist letter, which is a standard legal response to harassment. I can provide you with copies, along with documentation of the behavior that prompted it. I invited them in and showed them my carefully organized file. The photos Karen had taken of my property, the false violation notices, the timeline of city inspections she triggered. After they left, I called Linda to let her know what had happened. Karen called the police on you? She asked. I could hear the disbelief in her voice. David, that's concerning. False police reports are serious business. She paused and I could almost hear her thinking. What did you say the woman's name was again? Karen Thompson, I said. Lives 3 houses down. Black hair, always carrying a clipboard. Linda was quiet for a moment. She said finally. I think I might have taken one of her calls recently. Woman with a very distinctive voice. Very insistent about a neighbor situation. But the details seemed manufactured. That's when the first pieces started clicking into place. Linda, I said slowly. How many times has someone from this neighborhood called in complaints recently? She thought about it. Quite a few. Same voice. Same urgent tone. But whenever officers respond, there's never any real emergency. I spent the next morning doing what any reasonable person would do. When facing a systematic harassment campaign. Researched my opponent. What I found in the public records made my blood run cold. Karen Thompson wasn't just a difficult neighbor. She was a serial neighborhood terrorist. With a documented history of this exact behavior. The court records from her previous address in Arizona painted a disturbing picture. Karen had been named as the defendant in not 1 but 3 separate restraining order petitions filed by former neighbors. The complaints described a pattern of behavior that was depressingly familiar. False complaints to authorities, harassment campaigns, and attempts to manipulate HOA rules to target specific residents. But the most disturbing discovery came from the divorce records. Karen's ex-husband had filed for custody modification. The court documents included a psychological evaluation that described Karen as having an obsessive need for control, stemming from deep-seated insecurity, and a pattern of projecting personal failures onto external targets. I was still processing this information when Linda called from work. David, she said, her voice tight with concern. I need to ask you something. And I need you to be completely honest. Where were you yesterday afternoon around 3 p.m.? The question caught me off guard. At the grocery store, I said. Why? Because someone called 911, claiming you followed them home from the post office. And made threatening gestures from your car. Linda's voice was carefully professional, but I could hear the worry underneath. The caller was very specific about times, locations, and your alleged behavior. But David, if you were at the grocery store, I have the receipt, I said immediately, and the store has security cameras. We both went quiet as the implications sank in. Someone had made a detailed, false police report about my whereabouts and actions. Someone who either didn't know where I was, or didn't care about getting caught in a lie. That afternoon, I installed a comprehensive security system around my house, cameras covering every angle, motion sensors, and audio recording capabilities for the areas immediately around my property. If Karen wanted to escalate this conflict, I was going to make sure every interaction was documented. In high definition. The cameras were barely installed when they caught their first incident. Karen appeared in my front yard at 11 p.m. Not just walking by, but stepping onto my property to examine my mailbox. And take photos with her phone. The motion sensors triggered, bathing her in LED light. She looked directly into the camera, like a deer caught in headlights. Before hurrying away, the game changer came when Mrs. Chen knocked on my door that evening. Looking troubled. David, she said in her careful English. I need to tell you something. That woman Karen came to my house again today. She asked me to call the police about you. Mrs. Chen's expression was deeply troubled. She gave me a script to read, specific things to say about noise and threatening behavior. When I said no, she became very angry. Mrs. Chun handed me a piece of paper. The script Karen had written out for her to follow when calling 911. It was detailed, specific, and completely fabricated. Reading it, I realized that Karen had been attempting to orchestrate multiple false reports from different neighbors to create the appearance of a pattern. That night, Linda came home with news that confirmed my worst fears. 3 more calls today, she said, kicking off her shoes. Same voice, same urgent tone. But the stories are getting more elaborate. The caller is now claiming ongoing stalking. Property damage and threatening behavior. She looked at me. Seriously, David. Whoever this is, they're building up to something big. By Friday, I knew Karen was planning something big. The security cameras had caught her conducting what could only be described as surveillance, walking past my house at regular intervals. Always with her phone out, always stopping to take photos or make notes. That's when I decided to give Karen exactly what she wanted. A reason to make the biggest mistake of her life. I announced on Nextdoor that I'd be hosting a community barbecue that weekend. All neighbors welcome. Properly permitted with the city. And completely above board. I made sure to mention that several off-duty police officers from the neighborhood would be attending. Just neighbors, enjoying a weekend gathering. Linda managed to arrange her schedule so she'd be working dispatch that Saturday, the day of the barbecue. If something happens, she said, I want to be the one handling the calls. We both knew that if Karen was going to make her move. It would be during an event that brought the community together. In a way that excluded her. Saturday morning, I set up tables in my backyard, strung lights between the trees, and prepared for what I hoped would be a peaceful neighborhood gathering. Officer Martinez arrived early with his family, followed by 2 other off-duty officers who lived in nearby subdivisions. They were all in casual clothes. Just neighbors who happened to work in law enforcement. At 2 p.m., the party was in full swing. About 30 people had shown up, including several families, with children playing in the yard. The atmosphere was exactly what I'd hoped for. Relaxed, friendly, and completely normal. That's when I spotted Karen. She was standing at her front window, binoculars in hand. Watching my backyard like she was conducting military reconnaissance. Every few minutes, she'd make notes on a pad of paper, then return to watching. When she saw the police officers, her behavior became more agitated, pacing back and forth in front of her window. At 3:15 p.m., my phone buzzed with a text from Linda. Incoming call about your address. Caller claims emergency in progress, multiple violations and police corruption. This is it, David. Karen had made her move, and it was exactly as desperate and unhinged as I'd expected. According to Linda's quick text updates, Karen was reporting that I was hosting an illegal gathering with intimidation tactics, and that corrupt police officers were protecting criminal activity. She demanded an immediate response and threatened to contact federal authorities if local police didn't take action. The beautiful thing about Karen's call was that it was so obviously false that it exposed her entire campaign. Linda dispatched officers to verify the safety of the caller before responding to the alleged emergency at my address. It's standard protocol when someone reports criminal activity involving police officers. You check the credibility of the caller first. When Officers Johnson and Rodriguez arrived at Karen's house to ensure her safety, they found her standing in her front yard with binoculars and a notebook, clearly conducting surveillance rather than hiding from any threat. When they asked about the emergency she'd reported, Karen doubled down, insisting that I was terrorizing the neighborhood, and that the officers at my gathering were covering up criminal activity. The officers asked Karen to accompany them to my backyard, so they could investigate her claims together. What they found was about 30 neighbors having a peaceful barbecue, with children playing and adults chatting over burgers and Mrs. Chun's dumplings. The 3 off-duty officers were playing cornhole with their kids. Hardly the picture of a criminal conspiracy. Karen's reaction was spectacular. Faced with the complete disconnect between her emergency report and reality, she began insisting that everyone was acting to cover up what had been happening. She demanded that officers search my house for evidence of the weapons she'd reported, even though she now admitted she'd never actually seen any weapons. When Officer Johnson calmly explained that false emergency reporting was a serious crime, Karen's composure finally cracked completely. She started shouting about conspiracies, corruption, and how the entire neighborhood was ganging up on her. The contrast between her hysteria and the peaceful gathering happening 10 feet away was so stark that several neighbors stopped their conversations to stare. As the officers prepared to leave, Karen played her final card. "I'm calling my lawyer," she announced to everyone within earshot. "I'm suing all of you for harassment, for conspiracy, for violating my rights." She stormed back to her house, phone pressed to her ear, presumably trying to find an attorney willing to take her case. The next week brought a flurry of legal activity that even my former law colleagues would have found impressive in its scope and speed. Karen, true to her word, had hired an attorney and was attempting to file what she described as a comprehensive civil rights lawsuit against me, the police department, and half the neighborhood. The attorney she'd found was someone I recognized from my days practicing law. Marcus Webb, bottom feeder who specialized in frivolous lawsuits and had been sanctioned by the Bar Association multiple times for unethical conduct. But Webb's involvement worked in my favor. I knew his reputation. And more importantly, I knew he'd drop the case the moment he realized he couldn't win. The breakthrough came when Linda called me at work on Tuesday afternoon. "David," she said, her voice tight with excitement, "you need to get home. There's something you need to see." When I arrived, she had printed out a comprehensive report from the 911 system, showing every call that had been made about my address, or from Karen's address over the past 3 months. The pattern was damning. 57 calls in 12 weeks. All from the same number. All describing increasingly elaborate scenarios that never materialized when officers responded. The progression was clear. Starting with simple noise complaints, and escalating to claims of stalking, property damage, threats, and finally the false emergency at the barbecue. "This isn't just harassment," Linda said, pointing to the call log. "This is a systematic abuse of emergency services. The department takes this very seriously, because it ties up resources and creates dangerous situations." Armed with this evidence, I reached out to Webb's office and requested a meeting to discuss his client's case. Webb agreed, probably expecting to intimidate me into a quick settlement. Instead, I walked into his office with a banker's box full of documentation, my security camera footage queued up on a tablet, and Mrs. Chen's sworn statement about Karen's attempt to recruit her for false reporting. The meeting lasted exactly 17 minutes. Webb reviewed the 911 call logs, watched the footage of Karen trespassing on my property, and read through the public records I'd compiled about her history in other neighborhoods. When I finished presenting my evidence, he sat quietly for a long moment, then asked his assistant to cancel his other appointments for the day. "Mr. Martinez," he said finally, "my client may have been less than completely forthcoming about the circumstances of this dispute. That was lawyer speak for my client lied to me about everything." Webb withdrew from representation that afternoon, leaving Karen to face the legal consequences of her actions without counsel. The HOA board meeting that Thursday was standing room only. Word had spread through the neighborhood about Karen's arrest for filing false police reports. the investigation into her abuse of 911 services, and the revelation that she'd been conducting surveillance on multiple neighbors. The board had called an emergency session to address what they diplomatically termed recent leadership concerns. When called upon to address the board, Karen launched into what could only be described as a conspiracy theory presentation. According to her version of events, I was a criminal mastermind who had somehow corrupted the police department, intimidated the neighbors, and manipulated the HOA board into targeting her for enforcing community standards. The board listened, politely for about 10 minutes, before the president, a retired teacher named Margaret Foster, gently interrupted. "Karen," she said, "we've reviewed all the evidence you've submitted, as well as the evidence presented by other parties. We've also conducted our own investigation into your background and qualifications for HOA leadership." That's when the final shoe dropped. The board had discovered that Karen's HOA application contained several false statements, including a clean criminal background check, when public records showed convictions for harassment and filing false reports in 2 other states. Under the HOA bylaws, providing false information on leadership applications was grounds for immediate removal from all positions. What made the revelation even more devastating was the thoroughness of the board's investigation. They had contacted Karen's previous HOA associations and discovered a pattern that went back nearly a decade. 3 different communities had dealt with similar situations, each escalating to legal action and Karen's eventual departure. The board had also uncovered financial irregularities in HOA funds under Karen's management, including unauthorized payments to private investigators she'd hired to dig up dirt on residents she considered problematic. Mrs. Foster read excerpts from complaints filed in Arizona and Nevada, describing behavior so similar to what we'd experienced that it felt like reading a script. The board members looked genuinely disturbed as they realized they'd inadvertently elected someone with a documented history of community destruction. Karen's face grew paler with each revelation, her carefully constructed narrative crumbling in real time. As the evidence mounted against her, the next morning, a for sale sign appeared on Karen's front lawn. By that afternoon, a moving truck was parked in her driveway. The irony wasn't lost on me. Karen had moved to our neighborhood seeking control, authority, and the respect she felt she deserved. Instead, her inability to accept the simple word no had led to criminal charges, civil liability, complete social isolation, and ultimately forced her to abandon the community she tried so hard to dominate. 6 months after Karen's departure, our neighborhood had settled into something better than the quiet status quo we'd enjoyed before her arrival. The crisis had brought the community together in ways that surprised everyone, creating connections and friendships that might never have formed otherwise. The legal aftermath was swift and decisive. Karen pleaded guilty to multiple counts of filing false police reports in exchange for community service and mandatory psychological counseling. She was also ordered to pay restitution for the cost of the unnecessary police responses, which totaled nearly $8,000. Linda received a commendation from the police department for her professional handling of what the chief called a complex situation involving potential conflicts of interest. The commendation specifically praised her ability to maintain dispatcher protocols while recognizing patterns that might have been missed by others. She also got the promotion to shift supervisor she'd been working toward for months. The neighborhood changes were more subtle, but equally significant. Mrs. Chum started hosting monthly coffee mornings that drew neighbors from 3 surrounding blocks. The informal gatherings became so popular that we had to move them to the community center. These meetings evolved into a neighborhood watch program focused on mental health awareness, and recognizing when neighbors might need support rather than confrontation. The HOA underwent major reforms, implementing new bylaws that required background checks for all leadership positions, mandatory training on property rights and legal limitations, and a formal appeals process for any compliance disputes. We also established clear protocols for dealing with harassment complaints, ensuring that what happened with Karen couldn't happen again. I was elected to the HOA board on a platform of transparency and accountability, a role I'd never wanted but felt obligated to accept. Our first major initiative was creating a good neighbor guide that explained property rights, HOA limitations, and conflict resolution resources. The most satisfying development came 8 months after Karen's move, when I received a call from Detective Sarah Morrison in Karen's new city. "Mr. Martinez," she said, "I understand you had some issues with Karen Thompson, who recently moved to our area. She started exhibiting similar behaviors here, but her new neighbors had the benefit of learning from your experience." The detective explained that Karen's new neighbors had researched her background after initial confrontations and found news articles about our situation. Armed with that knowledge, they documented her behavior from the beginning and contacted authorities at the first sign of false reporting. "Your case created a precedent that helped us address the situation before it escalated," Morrison said. "The personal victory was important, but the community transformation was even more meaningful. Our neighborhood had learned that the best defense against people like Karen isn't just individual resistance, but collective awareness and mutual support. We'd created something stronger than what we'd had before, a community that could recognize manipulation and respond with both compassion and firm boundaries." 1 year later, I installed a small plaque by my front door that read, "This home is protected by good neighbors, clear boundaries, professional emergency services, and the power of documentation." It was partly a joke, but mostly a reminder of what we'd learned about standing up to bullies while maintaining our values and community bonds. Looking back, Karen did us an unexpected favor. She forced our community to examine our systems, strengthen our bonds with each other, and develop the tools to handle future challenges with wisdom rather than just reaction. In trying to control us, she made us more independent, more connected, and more resilient. The ripple effects of our experience continued to spread in unexpected ways. Local law enforcement began using our case as a training example for dispatchers on recognizing patterns of false reporting and harassment campaigns. The city updated its complaint procedures to include cross-referencing systems that would flag repeated frivolous reports from the same sources. Our HOA reforms were adopted by neighboring communities as a template for preventing similar situations. Mrs. Chun became something of a local celebrity, her quiet courage in refusing to participate in Karen's schemes, inspiring other residents to speak up when they witnessed bullying behavior. The community garden project that grew out of our monthly gatherings became a model for neighborhood engagement, attracting visitors from across the county who wanted to learn how we'd transformed conflict into collaboration. Most surprisingly, the local bar association invited me to speak at their annual conference about the intersection of neighborhood disputes and legal rights, turning our ordeal into an educational opportunity for other attorneys dealing with similar cases. And that, I think, is the best kind of victory, the kind where everyone eventually wins. If this story resonated with you, if you've dealt with your own neighborhood Karen, or if you just love seeing justice served through patience and proper documentation, rather than escalation and drama, hit that like button and subscribe for more real-life stories about standing up to bullies the smart way. Have you ever had to deal with someone who just couldn't take no for an answer? Drop your stories in the comments. I read every single one. And who knows, Your experience might help someone else navigate their difficult neighbor situation. Remember, the best way to deal with people who abuse power is to know your rights, document everything, and build a community that has your back.